The morning sun hung heavy over the wide, endless acres of Evergrow Industries' experimental agricultural facility, a gleaming project nestled deep in the rural folds of Georgia, where humidity clung to the skin like a second layer and the thick scent of soil and machinery intertwined in the air like an unbreakable cord. Here, where rows upon rows of crops rippled in the breeze like a golden sea, was where technology met tradition in uneasy harmony. And on this particular morning, that harmony had shattered with a deafening thud when one of the company's most prized machines, a towering, fully automated produce sorter that cost north of $1 million to construct and calibrate, ground to an abrupt and harrowing halt during mid-cycle, its internal sensors blinking red, its motors emitting a soft metallic groan that signaled nothing short of operational disaster, especially with a high-stakes investor tour scheduled within 48 hours. A visit on which the future funding and possible nationwide expansion of the entire Evergrow initiative depended. Chaos ignited instantly within the operations bay. A sprawling control center decked out in digital panels, glass walls, buzzing radios, and a team of white-collar engineers and managers who now stood frozen in panic as the assembly line backed up and the flashing lights painted the room in a strobe of blinking warning. Red, 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 until the double doors burst open and in stormed the man who demanded results more than explanations, the one whose mere presence could silence a room. CEO Mitchell Langston, 52, impeccably dressed in a custom-cut navy suit, jaw clenched, tie sharp and temperament volatile, whose booming voice instantly cut through the low murmur of dread, like a blade through ripe sugarcane, demanding with barely restrained fury, "Who the hell is in charge of fixing this thing?" And for a long moment no one responded, the silence so thick it could have been sliced with a scalpel, until a middle-aged foreman with a sweat-soaked baseball cap and calloused hands stepped forward timidly, voice shaking, and admitted, "Sir, the diagnostics technician is off-site in Atlanta for the week, and we haven't been able to reach anyone else yet." Langston's eyes narrowed dangerously. "So what, we just stand around and pray this fixes itself?" he barked, to which the foreman quickly added, "No, sir, but there's a kid, out, back in the equipment shed. He's not officially on the team, but he's been helping with the machinery. He knows these models better than most folks, actually. Name's Jeremiah Ellis. He's the son of the farmhand, Mr. Ellis, one of the folks who's worked the fields for years." And Langston, never a man to entertain vague solutions, scoffed with thinly veiled contempt. "A kid? You want me to trust $1 million sorter to a kid whose daddy probably fixes tractors with duct tape?" But desperation has a way of forcing even the proudest men to lower their defenses, and when the foreman held his ground with an oddly quiet conviction, Langston finally snapped, "Fine, get the kid. Now." And within minutes, amidst the electrical hum and the rising anxiety of halted production, the doors opened again, and in stepped Jeremiah Ellis, a tall, wiry 17-year-old with a calmness that contrasted the energy around him like a still lake among stormy skies, dressed in grease-stained overalls, steel-toe boots, and a utility belt that clinked faintly with every step. His deep brown skin glistened with sweat, dreadlocks pulled neatly into a band behind his head, and in his eyes an unsettling clarity, one that saw not chaos but systems, patterns, solutions. And Langston, arms crossed with skepticism, looked him over and asked in a clipped tone, "You the one who supposedly knows how this thing works?" To which Jeremiah nodded respectfully. "Yes, sir. Not defensive, not arrogant, just honest," and then added, "I've studied the systems. I read the engineering manuals last year when y'all installed this model, and I've watched its cycle every day for 6 months. Judging by the flashing error codes and the sound, I think it's the sensor relay on the input chute. It tends to overheat if the left side calibration pin isn't aligned during fast sort mode," a statement so technical and precise that half the room blinked in disbelief. Langston squinted, not sure whether to feel insulted, amused, or intrigued, and waved dismissively toward the machine. "Fine, fix it. But if you mess this up—" "I won't," Jeremiah said simply, already walking toward the sorter like it was an old friend he was about to comfort back to life. As a dozen executives and operators looked on, the boy opened the primary access panel with practiced ease, bypassed the digital lock using a sequence he clearly learned through careful observation, and began scanning the internals with a handheld, diagnostic tool of his own design, built from spare parts Langston would later learn, while simultaneously tightening 3 tension valves and adjusting the alignment of the optical sensor, using nothing but an Allen key and intuition that bordered on genius, all in under 10 minutes, and just as the tension in the room hit its peak, the machine rumbled back to life with a soft chime and resumed its sorting cycle as if nothing had ever gone wrong, spitting out crates of perfectly scanned produce with a hum that was, in that moment, the sweetest sound Langston had ever heard, triggering a burst of spontaneous applause and murmurs of disbelief from everyone present, some clapping Jeremiah on the back, others just staring at him as if he had materialized out of thin air, and Langston, who had prided himself on knowing every talent in his company, every potential liability, every minor cog in the great machine of Evergrow, found himself feeling something rare, uncertainty, and not just about the boy's skills, but about the assumptions he himself had carried in that room, assumptions about who belongs where, who can offer value, who deserves a voice. He stared hard at Jeremiah, the boy now quietly returning tools to his belt, brushing grease from his hands, unmoved by the attention, and asked, "Who exactly is your father again?" A question that came out quieter than intended, more thoughtful than confrontational, but Jeremiah only offered a small knowing smile and replied, "You'll know soon enough, sir," before turning and walking calmly toward the exit, leaving Langston and the rest of his team standing amidst a whirring machine, blinking lights, and the growing awareness that something deeper had just been set in motion, something far greater than a simple repair. The next morning, as the Georgia sun poured its golden heat across the sprawling acres of Evergrow's land, CEO Mitchell Langston sat alone in his private glass-walled office, his usual morning ritual of scanning investor updates and reviewing progress reports completely disrupted by one thing. Jeremiah Ellis, the teenage boy, who had not only fixed $1 million machine faster than Langston's entire engineering staff, but had also left the CEO with a disarming smile and a cryptic sentence, "You'll know soon enough, sir." The words haunted him in a way that wasn't fear, but rather a gnawing curiosity, one that made him feel like a man who had walked through his own house and suddenly realized a secret door had always been there, hidden in plain sight. Langston prided himself on control, on knowing the ins and outs of every corner of his empire, from the corporate headquarters to the soybean fields, and yet this boy had blindsided him with competence, with humility, with untrained genius, and the more he thought about it, the more it rattled him that such brilliance had gone unnoticed, undocumented, unutilized in a world obsessed with credentials, resumes, and social capital. Something didn't add up, so he called his executive assistant, Morgan, and ordered her to pull the employment file on Jeremiah Ellis and his father, Mr. Ellis, whom Langston only vaguely remembered as one of the many field hands who worked. The property's edge, always punctual, never troublesome, never seeking promotions or attention, the kind of man who stayed out of sight and out of mind, and Langston, being the numbers and results type, never paid closer attention until now. When Morgan returned 20 minutes later with a thin, unimpressive manila folder labeled Elijah Ellis, Field Ops, Unit 7, Langston opened it expecting to find the usual, a basic background check, perhaps a high school diploma, years of loyal low-level work, maybe a few minor disciplinary notes, not because Ellis was a troublemaker, but simply because everyone had something, but instead what he found was silence, no educational history, no employment prior to Evergrow, no emergency contacts, just a single-page intake form from 15 years ago, noting that Mr. Elijah Ellis had relocated from Boston, listed no former employer, and declined to provide references, and somehow none of that raised flags back then because he was just applying for manual labor, a role nobody scrutinized heavily, and yet the handwriting on the form was pristine, elegant, mathematical, the kind of handwriting engineers and architects tend to have, deliberate and balanced, and it piqued Langston's interest enough to dig deeper, calling in a favor from a friend at a private background tracing firm. What came back a few hours later made Langston sit back in his chair and blink at the screen, because it turned out that Mr. Elijah Ellis wasn't just a field hand, He was once Dr. Elijah M. Ellis, former Associate Professor of Mechanical Systems at MIT, recipient of 2 National Science Foundation grants, one of the original architects behind modular automated harvesting designs in the late 90s, co-inventor of a patented AI sensory module still in use in some John Deere prototypes, and then abrupt disappearance around 2005, no academic papers published after that year, no professional employment records, just gone, vanished from the professional world, until reappearing on Langston's own company payroll years later as a laborer, a man who had seemingly stepped away from the scientific world to dig rows and haul crops under the southern sun, and, as Langston stared at the digital archive, he began to feel a strange mix of awe, confusion, and yes, guilt, because the father of the boy who'd just saved his entire operations was not some backwoods amateur mechanic. He was a pioneer in the very systems Evergrow used, a silent giant who had been working in anonymity within spitting distance of the company's cutting-edge machines, and Langston had never known. Compelled by a mixture of respect and embarrassment, Langston decided he needed to meet this man himself, to ask the question that burned at him more than any other. Why would a man with such genius, credentials that could command 6 figures in any industry, choose to vanish into the rural shadows and raise his son among tractors and rows instead of lecture halls and R&D labs? So later that day, Langston ditched his usual executive SUV and drove himself across the dusty access roads to the far east side of the property where the field workers lived, small family-owned cottages nestled beside rows of oak trees and weathered sheds, and when he arrived at the Ellis residence, a modest wooden house with a wraparound porch, freshly swept steps and potted herbs growing near the windows, he was greeted not by surprise or deference, but by a calm older man tending to tomato plants in the garden, his sleeves rolled up, skin weathered but posture dignified, and Langston knew instantly this was him. "Mr. Ellis?" Langston called, stepping forward uncertainly, and the man turned, wiped his hands on a cloth, and said with a low, deep voice filled with composure, "I know who you are," before offering a chair on the porch and adding, "Come sit, Mr. Langston." So they sat, 2 men from very different worlds, joined by a single point of connection neither of them could deny anymore: Jeremiah. Langston began awkwardly, complimenting the garden, thanking him for his years of service before finally cutting to the truth. "Your son fixed a machine in 10 minutes that my engineers couldn't solve in 2 hours. I need to know, how?" And Ellis chuckled softly, not out of arrogance but understanding. "That boy's been building things since he was 8. When other kids played video games, he reverse-engineered broken appliances. He has an eye, a gift." And Langston leaned in. "But it's more than that. He speaks in systems. He sees architecture. That's not something farm life teaches," to which the older man nodded slowly. "I know, because I taught him." And then he looked Langston directly in the eye and added, "Before this life, I worked at MIT, taught mechanical systems, helped build the early frameworks for automated harvesting before anyone thought it'd be practical. But the world I left behind, it wasn't kind to men like me. They respected my work, but not my voice. I was invited to panels, but never to lead them. I had patents, but someone else always signed first." And he leaned back, voice steady. "When my wife got sick, I chose to come here, to live slow, to raise my son in peace. I didn't want him chasing approval from a world that would never fully see him. I wanted him to build, not to beg." And Langston was stunned, silenced, floored by the weight of the man's quiet strength, because in that moment he realized that this wasn't just a story of missed opportunity. It was a story of quiet resistance, of a brilliant man choosing dignity over recognition, and in doing so raising a son who was not just brilliant, but humble, not just gifted, but grounded. Langston swallowed, unsure of what to say next, until finally, with deep sincerity, he said, "I'm sorry. For not knowing. For not seeing." And Ellis nodded once more, not out of bitterness, but finality. "Most don't, but some do. Eventually." And then Langston asked what felt like the most important question of the day: "What does Jeremiah want?" And the father answered without hesitation, "To build, but on his terms, He doesn't want a handout. He wants a chance to solve real problems, that's all. And as the CEO sat there beneath the creaking shade of the porch roof, watching the wind ripple through the cornfields in the distance, he knew two things with clarity. One, that Evergrow's future had already changed, and two, that the most powerful minds often bloom in the most overlooked soil, and if he was wise, he'd start watering those roots now before another company saw what he nearly missed. The very next week, the Evergrow facility buzzed with an electricity it hadn't known in years. Not from machines or generators, but from whispered conversations, side glances, and the hushed reverence that trailed Jeremiah Ellis wherever he walked, for news had quietly spread throughout the company after Langston's unannounced visit to the far field. A visit that wasn't routine, wasn't scheduled, and ended with the CEO personally shaking the hand of a man every laborer knew, but never questioned. While official announcements hadn't yet been made, the air was already different, like the moment before a thunderstorm when the wind carries a weight it didn't have before. And Jeremiah, just 17, felt that weight on his shoulders. As he returned to the workshop floor, not with fear but with the poised stillness of someone who had been preparing for this moment in silence for years, fixing radios with nails, building motor replicas from wire hangers, solving puzzles in his father's shed that adults with degrees would later struggle to grasp. And now, standing inside the heart of Evergrow's automation division, Jeremiah was no longer just a worker's son. He was an anomaly in motion, a living question the executives couldn't answer, but couldn't ignore either. And yet none of it changed the boy. He still wore the same canvas work jacket, still nodded politely at janitors and smiled at receptionists, still helped Ms. Rosa from accounting carry her broken printer to the tech desk without being asked, and that humility, perhaps more than his brilliance, is what struck Langston when he watched him again, this time not from a position of dismissal, but of wonder. And so he made a decision that shocked his entire executive team. He created a brand new internship program titled Evergrow Innovators Initiative, and named Jeremiah its first lead, an unpaid role on paper, but one with full access to the company's labs, engineering floors, prototype facilities, and mentorship from every division head. And while some scoffed, whispering about nepotism or rushed PR stunts, Langston ignored them because he had seen enough to trust his instinct this time. And what followed was nothing short of transformational. In the first week alone, Jeremiah corrected a design flaw in the seed dispensing unit that had been costing the company $3.2 million in yearly waste, an inefficiency no one had noticed because it was spread across dozens of machines and buried in acceptable margins. Yet the boy spotted it after 2 hours with a clipboard and his father's old calculator. By the second week, he'd redesigned a critical blade in the harvester unit using cheaper alloy composites, improving its lifespan by 27%, and within the first month, department heads who once rolled their eyes at his presence now scheduled meetings with him, emailed him blueprints for review and genuinely asked for his thoughts. And though he never flaunted it, the quiet confidence with which Jeremiah moved, pen tucked behind his ear, sketches rolled under his arm, hands calloused from both soil and steel, spoke louder than any resume ever could. Meanwhile, Langston found himself spending more time reflecting on his own journey, recalling how many years he'd spent chasing legacy and shareholder approval, only to be outdone by a boy with no LinkedIn profile, no LinkedIn at all, in fact, and a father who had willingly walked away from it all, and it humbled him in ways he never admitted out loud. Even as he drafted the next phase of the initiative, one that would invite disadvantaged youth from rural communities across Georgia to visit Evergrow's labs and see firsthand what innovation could look like in their hands, a program inspired by Jeremiah's story, which was now quietly making waves beyond the company. Local journalists began asking questions. A few industry insiders whispered about the genius farm kid from Georgia, and even a major agri-tech podcast requested an anonymous interview, which Jeremiah declined, saying simply, "I'm still learning. I'd rather build first, talk later." And that quote alone circulated LinkedIn and Twitter for weeks, reshared by executives, educators, and inventors as a callback to real merit, real passion, untouched by ego or marketing polish. But beneath the excitement, There was still one person Jeremiah hadn't fully spoken to about all of it: his father. Elijah Ellis remained quiet, proud but reserved, watching his son rise with a steady gaze, rarely commenting, never interfering. Yet one evening, as the sun dropped behind the peach groves and the frogs began their chorus, Jeremiah sat beside his father on the porch and finally asked, "Do you think I'm ready for this?" And Elijah looked at him, eyes heavy with both history and hope, and answered, "You were born ready. What you're doing now, that's just your hands catching up to what your heart already knows." And in that quiet blessing, Jeremiah found the strength to take the next step when Langston approached him with an even bolder offer: to co-lead the R&D team on a new harvesting prototype designed entirely in-house, a machine that would merge AI predictive mapping with soil-sensitive harvesting, a project others had attempted and failed, citing too many variables. But Langston believed that between his seasoned engineers and Jeremiah's unique, intuitive grasp of mechanics, they just might pull it off. And when he asked the boy who he wanted as his technical advisor, Jeremiah answered without pause, "My father," which stunned Langston into a smile. And the next morning, for the first time in nearly 2 decades, Dr. Elijah Ellis walked back into a laboratory, not at MIT, not at Stanford, but on his own, terms beside his son, in a workshop of a company that had once overlooked him, now redesigned by the very brilliance they nearly buried. And that day, as father and son unrolled schematics on the table and began speaking in codes, wires, torque, and vision, everyone watching knew they were witnessing more than innovation. They were witnessing a legacy mending itself in real time, a torch passed not from father to son, but shared between them, burning brighter than ever. And somewhere in that lab, amid the sparks and ideas, a new kind of future was being built, not just for Evergrow, but for every forgotten genius who had ever been told to stay in the shadows. The sun rose over the Evergrow campus with a golden intensity that seemed to symbolize the renaissance the company was undergoing, not in profits alone, though those were soaring, but in spirit, in energy, in the unquantifiable current that flowed through its hallways, boardrooms, and breakrooms alike, where whispers of Jeremiah and Elijah no longer held the reverence of myth, but the respect of realization, because what began as a shock, a teenage farmhand and his reclusive father walking into R&D as equals, had evolved into an unstoppable wave of progress, powered by generational brilliance and quiet determination. The prototype, dubbed Project Eden, had already outpaced development expectations by months, integrating AI-driven terrain mapping with dynamic pressure sensors that could detect the moisture, health, and maturity of crops in real time. Harvesting only what was ready, reducing waste by nearly 40% and increasing efficiency across terrains previously thought too delicate or uneven for machines. Yet the technology was only part of the story, for it was the process, the collaboration, the symphony of minds, hands, and hearts that turned Evergrow from a company into a movement. Engineers once siloed by age, race, and hierarchy now collaborated like never before, inspired by Elijah's humility and Jeremiah's open-mindedness, while Langston, the CEO who had once barked orders and measured worth by credentials and suits, now found himself learning from those he'd previously overlooked, especially the Ellis family, whose bond reminded him of something deeper he'd lost along the way, the soul of innovation, the integrity of leadership, and the reason he'd started Evergrow in the first place, not to dominate the industry but to change lives. And lives were being changed, from the cafeteria workers who now found themselves invited to tech showcases, to interns from disadvantaged schools across Georgia who sat beside engineers, not behind them, encouraged to ask questions and sketch out their own designs without fear of condescension. Because if a farmer's son could lead a revolution, then who else had been hiding brilliance behind brown hands, calloused fingers, second-hand shoes? And this question, this awakening, reached far beyond Evergrow's gates, attracting national media, think tanks, and eventually a private invite to the U.S. Department of Agriculture's Future Tech Summit, where Jeremiah was scheduled to speak as the youngest inventor ever, to present a government-backed sustainable harvesting prototype, though he almost declined until Elijah reminded him that changing the world meant stepping into rooms not built for you and refusing to shrink. When you got there, So he agreed reluctantly, nervously, until the morning of his speech, when he walked on stage in a plain shirt and worn boots, glanced once toward the front row, where his father sat nodding silently, and began to speak, not with polish, not with rehearsed lines, but with raw, profound clarity, telling a crowd of senators, CEOs, and scientists, "I didn't grow up thinking I'd build machines. I grew up watching my father fix things no one thought were broken. Systems, people, expectations. I guess I'm just doing the same thing, with metal instead of words." And that line alone earned a standing ovation, not because it was poetic, but because it was real, undeniable, and in that moment, a spotlight that had once overlooked kids, like him, now blazed with pride. And after the summit, partnerships flooded in. Harvard's Agri-Innovation Program offered him a dual mentorship. NASA reached out to inquire if his predictive models could help with crop viability on Martian soil. Major universities requested Elijah's unpublished papers, long buried in boxes under their porch, while Evergrow, under Langston's leadership, launched the Ellis Fellowship, granting 10 full scholarships annually to rural students of color, with interests in mechanical and agricultural engineering, and each recipient would receive not just funding, but mentorship directly from the Ellis family, who by now had become legends, not of the celebrity kind, but of the kind that moved quietly, built deliberately, and led by example. Yet through all the praise, accolades, and interviews, Jeremiah remained grounded, still walking the old field with his father at dusk, still tinkering with spare parts under a cracked lamp in the barn, still pausing when he passed by the old tractor that started it all, the one Langston had once scoffed at, then gawked at, then learned from. And sometimes in the hush of evening, he would smile and whisper, "Thank you, old friend," because even machines have chapters in a story like this. And one afternoon, months after the prototype went into mass production and began changing the face of modern farming from Mississippi to Malawi, Langston called for a full company gathering, not for an earnings report, not for a press stunt, but for a quiet ceremony in the Evergrow courtyard, where he unveiled a bronze sculpture. It was of two hands, one older, scarred, firm, the other young, open, reaching, not labeled by name but titled simply "Legacy in Motion," and beneath it an inscription read, "To those who fix what others ignore, to those who build not just machines, but futures." And in the crowd, Elijah nodded once, his eyes misty, while Jeremiah, humbled and awed, turned to his father and said, "I think we finally fixed more than machines, didn't we?" And Elijah, his voice quiet but steady, replied, "No, son. We just reminded the world who the real builders always were." And in that moment, surrounded by applause, by sunlight, by the echoes of generations past, and the promise of what's to come, the story came full circle. Not an ending, but a new beginning, born not in boardrooms or balance sheets, but in the soil of truth, the steel of genius, and the blood of a boy and his father who never stopped believing.